welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. It's me. I'm your host and interviewer now, 6 years, nearly 400 episodes, where we've had the honor and the privilege to speak with many of the world's most iconic thought leaders, business leaders, CEOs, entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, athletes, experts, celebrities, authors, scientists, researchers, academics, you name it, they have come to On Leadership. And on occasion, some of them come back. Rarely, but when they have such seminal work like today's guest, we invite them back and hope they will grace us with their new learnings. I will tell you, in nearly 400 interviews taped, today's guest is clearly one of my top 5 favorite, primarily because her work has, I think, changed the landscape of not just large organizations, but Inc. 500 and Russell 2000 and mom and pops and startups, because she herself has been a lifelong entrepreneur and intrapreneur. Her book, the first book she wrote, of course, is called Radical Candor. This book has permeated all the books that I have written about. I give her credit on, I think, really reshaping the landscape of communication. Of course, the opposite of radical candor, you might call, is ruinous empathy, and talk about a great term that companies have wrestled with. Her first book was called Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. This book went on to shape the conversations and cultures of organizations worldwide. And then Kim Scott, as a renowned entrepreneur, did what a lot of authors do. She went on and created a second book that launched a couple of years ago called Just Work. We had her back on to interview her for the second time on Just Work. And it was an interesting departure from her early writings around radical candor. And through her own conversation today, she'll talk about how she actually has retooled the key tenets of Just Work in this new release called Radical Respect, how to work together better. Very excited to talk about lessons learned, insights, and how to make sure all of us work better together. Kim Scott, welcome back to On Leadership.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I always love a good conversation with you.
I have told the story of your learnings from Google when you were presenting the AdSense results with Eric Schmidt and the co-founder, and of course your boss at the time, and all that you've learned. I have shared that hundreds of times from stages, because if Kim Scott can talk about it, everybody else can be self-aware. I would love for you just to indulge me. And could you please open our conversation and recreate the discussion you and Sheryl Sandberg had? I'm sorry to belabor that, but there's so many great insights in the debrief you and she had from your conversation as you were sharing AdSense. Will you just take 5 minutes, indulge me, and reshare that conversation?
I would love to do that. I mean, it's incredible how much you can get out of just a moment of conversation. So I had just started a new job at Google, and I had to give a presentation to the founders and the CEO about how the AdSense business was doing. And I walked into the room, and there in one corner of the room was Sergey Brin on an elliptical trainer, stepping away, wearing toe shoes and a bright blue spandex unitard. Not super tight. Not what I was expecting or frankly wanting to see in the room. And there in the other corner of the room was Eric Schmidt doing his email, like banging away on his computer. It was like his brain had been plugged into the machine. So probably just like you and all of your listeners, I felt a little bit nervous. How was I supposed to get these people's attention? Luckily for me, the AdSense business was on fire. And when I said how many new customers we had added, Eric Schmidt, the CEO, almost fell off his chair. What did you say? This is incredible. Do you need more marketing dollars? Do you need more engineers? So I'm feeling like the meeting's going all right. In fact, I now believe that I am a genius. And I walked out of the room after the meeting was over. I walked past Sheryl, and I'm expecting a high five, a pat on the back. And instead, she says to me, why don't you walk back to my office with me? And I thought, oh, wow, I messed something up in there, and I'm sure I'm about to hear about it. But of course, I was kind of open to hearing from her because I felt dread, but also she had solicited feedback from me in the past and rewarded the candor when she got it. So I knew the context. And as we started walking, Cheryl began not by telling me what had gone wrong in the meeting, but by pointing out the things that had gone well. Not in the feedback sandwich sense of the word. I think there's a less polite way to say that, but not in the sort of kiss me, kick me, kiss me sense of the word, but really seeming to mean what she said. But of course, all I wanted to hear about was what I had done wrong. And eventually she said to me, "You said a lot in there. Were you aware of it?" And with this, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, because if that was all I had done wrong, who really cared? And I kind of made this brush-off gesture with my hand. I said, "Yeah, I know, it's a verbal tic. It's no big deal, really." And then she said to me, "I know this great speech coach. I bet Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction?" And once again, I made this brush-off gesture with my hand. I said, "No, I'm busy. I don't have time for a speech coach. Didn't you hear about all those new customers?" And then she stopped. She looked me right in the eye, and she said, "I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid." Now she's got my full attention. And some people might say it was mean of her to say I sounded stupid. But in fact, it was the kindest thing that she could have done for me at that moment in my career, because if she hadn't used just those words with me, and by the way, this is a really important point, she never would have used those words with other people on her team who were perhaps better listeners than I was. But if she hadn't used just those words with me, I never would have gone to visit the speech coach, and I would not have learned that she was not exaggerating. I literally said every third word. And this was news to me, because I had been giving presentations my whole career. I had raised lots of money for several different startups giving presentations. I thought I was pretty good at it. It was almost like I suddenly realized I'd been marching through my whole career with a giant hunk of spinach between my teeth, and nobody had told me about it. Nobody had had the common courtesy to tell me about it. And this really got me thinking, why had no one told me? But also, perhaps more interestingly, what was it about Cheryl's management style that made it so seemingly easy for her to tell me? And as I thought about her management style, I realized it really boiled down to two pretty basic, seemingly basic things. She cared personally, and she challenged directly at the same time. I knew that she cared about me not just as an employee, but as a human being, because she would do things like when I first moved from New York to California, I didn't know anyone out here in California, and I was lonely, and she could tell I was lonely. And she said to me that she knew this great book group and introduced me to them. I'm still friends with those people to this day. When also shortly after I moved out here and took the job, my father was diagnosed with late-stage cancer. And I was devastated, and she could tell that I was devastated. And she said, "Kim, you need to go to the airport, fly home to Memphis. You need to be with your family in Memphis. Your team and I will sit down, and we will write your coverage plan." That is what great teams do for each other. They've got each other's back. And those were the kinds of things that she did, not just for me, but for everyone who worked closely with her. She couldn't, of course, do those kinds of things for all 5,000 people in her organization. No matter how talented you are, relationships don't scale. But culture does scale, and when a leader treats their direct reports with that kind of care, it's much more likely that their direct reports in turn will treat their direct reports with that kind of care. And that creates a caring culture, and that does scale. But of course, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. There was also this challenge directly part of radical candor. And you know, that's the part I think that a lot of us fail to deliver on. We remember to show we care because most people are pretty nice, but we fail to challenge directly. And as I thought about those, those two basic tenets, care personally, challenge directly, I thought this doesn't seem doesn't seem radical, doesn't seem even like it ought to be all that rare, and yet it is rare. It's so rare. I've worked with tons of different kinds of people, and I've never met anyone who said, "Oh, feedback is easy for me." In fact, I was teaching a class at Stanford Graduate School of Business the other day, and somebody said, feedback is a source of existential dread for me. and so that is what really prompted me to sit down and really think through radical candor, which is what I call the combination of caring personally and challenging directly.
Kim, thank you for indulging me. Not that you need me to, but I implore you to keep telling that story because there's such great insight to tease out of it. Stephen Covey, his oldest son, Stephen M.R. Covey, who wrote the book, The Speed of Trust, will tell you that one of the top 2 contributions that leaders make is giving feedback on people's blind spots, moving outside of their comfort zone and giving feedback. And your book, Radical Candor, is by degrees of magnitude the best framework in which to do that. So thank you for talking about that and resharing that story. Now, here's an interesting pivot. A couple of years ago, you wrote this book called Just Work. It was a solid book on working together and understanding boundaries and sensitivities and kind of where society was moving. It was sort of in the middle of the pandemic and DEI and all of that, that important stuff, Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. And it did not hit as well as your first book. And I would love to just kind of open it up to have you talk about what was that like as an author to have hit it out of the park with your first book, Radical Candor, where you couldn't even find the ball. This book has done so well. And then you launched a second book to a little bit of a less, you could find the ball.
Less fanfare.
Less fanfare, but you did something bold, which you rarely see in authors. You picked up what was great of Just Work and you listened to feedback. You teased out the best parts, and then you have relaunched it, renamed it, and rebranded it. And this is why we're here today to talk about this new book, Radical Respect. Talk about that journey, because there's some insights to be teased out from that. And then we'll talk about some of the key concepts in Radical Respect.
Yes. So Just Work, I mean, I think it's fair to say it just didn't work. At least it didn't work the way that I wanted it to work. And I think there were a number of issues. Partly was just the title. Some people read the title and thought it was about return to office, which is not what the book was about. They missed the justice part of Just Work. And it's interesting, when I wrote the book, for me, the word justice has nothing but positive connotations. But one of the many things that I learned is that a lot of people feel resistance to the word justice. And that really got me thinking. The other, I think I owe a lot to friends of mine, several friends of mine, one in particular, Ann Paletti, who I worked in Russia with and went to business school with, and who's a good friend. After the book came out, she called me up and she said, Kim, I think you lost your voice in that book. And I realized when she said this that she was exactly right. And but I didn't quite know why. And part of the reason why I knew she was right is that I had started a podcast with Ernest Adams, who leads DEI at Ford Motor Company. And what we would do is we would read a passage from Just Work every week. And as I read these passages, suddenly, and I had that conversation with Ann Paletti in my head, and one day I read a passage and I was like, I know why this book didn't do that well. I wasn't finished writing it. The hardest thing about writing a book is getting inside your head. And then the second hardest thing is getting back out. And I think I tried to get back out of my head before I was ready. And I think part of what was going on is that, Radical Respect is about creating a workplace that optimizes for collaboration and that honors everyone's individuality. And it talks a lot about what gets in the way: bias, prejudice, bullying, discrimination, harassment, and physical violence. Physical violations, not always violent. And I, as a white woman, I felt sort of conflicted as I was writing the book. Part of me felt like I had an extra obligation to write the book because Radical Candor had been successful. I had found some privilege, and just because of the unfair advantages one has in the world of being white. And at the same time, I also felt that I had no right to write the book as a white woman because I hadn't experienced as much bias, prejudice, bullying, discrimination, harassment, and physical violations as other people had. And I think I hadn't finished wrestling with that internal ambivalence as I wrote the book. And I think it came out in the way that I used language. And so that was one of the things that I really wanted to change. So like almost every word in the book got edited and in fact, a lot of them got edited out. It's 40,000 words shorter. That was another problem. The book was too long. So those are kind of some of the big things that I tried to fix. I think the last big difference is that I totally reordered the book. And I start now with the chapter on what leaders can do, because I realized that that is what people were looking for from me. But it's also really important. I left the other chapters about what we can do as upstanders, what we can do as people who are harmed by disrespectful attitudes and behaviors, and what we can do when we ourselves are the person who caused harm with our own disrespectful attitudes and behaviors, which we all have. All of us are bound to exhibit those. Because leaders cannot solve this problem alone. Leaders have a really important role to play, but we've all got to come together if we're going to solve these problems.
Okay, I'm going to pay you a couple of compliments. Facts notwithstanding, I'm a huge Kim Scott fan. This took some courage because I'm in the book business 30 years, right? I'm an author. I've released 7 myself. I host this podcast. I helped Franklin Covey produce and sell 70 million books across their titles. I'm a literary agent. You know, I know nothing about Six Sigma or AI, but I know a 2 or thing about books.
About writing. Yes.
And you have done a masterful but courageous job. Most authors would say, oh, well, on to the next. And most publishers would say, oh, well, don't call us, we'll call you. Probably not your case. But you chose very deliberately to say, no, I got this wrong, and I want to get it right. And so you went back to the drawing board. You were extraordinarily vulnerable by both receiving and soliciting feedback, what worked, what didn't work. Some of it was an aha, some of it was a no-brainer. You re-edited the entire book. You left 40,000 words on the cutting floor. This is a labor of love because you wrote those words. And that, no, that's important. And then you rebranded it. And I'll tell you, I think it's so smart of you because this book is not a push DEI book. This book is it's a compendium of what great people do in 2024 and beyond, about understanding bias and prejudice, understanding discrimination and harassment, understanding physical violations, but you write it in a way where someone like me, also a white man of privilege, can say, you know what, I've done that. You know what, I've thought that way. You know, I found myself, and it was not at all intimidating. I want to come back to that in just a moment because you said something profound. You talked about how you are a white woman of privilege. I think there are many millions of white Americans who still do not understand or agree with this concept. And the only way to educate people like you and I that there is a thing when you are white of having an unfair advantage. And I don't think white Americans can learn it from people other than white Americans. Will you just take a minute without polarizing the audience, which you wouldn't do? What does it mean to have privilege, and why is that still true in your mind as a white woman?
Yeah, you know, I don't love the word either. And in fact, Claudia Rankine says, who's a wonderful poet, says she also doesn't like the word. She wishes it was called, I think she said she wished it were called just white being. And so what am I talking about? I'm talking about the ability to get pulled over by the police when I speed, as I do sometimes, and have no fear about what's going to happen to me. I can pull over and with great confidence feel like, you know, the worst that's going to happen is I'm going to get a ticket. It is about being able to walk into a room And I get all kinds of it's interesting being a white woman. I get all kinds of automatic credit that I don't deserve, and I also get all kinds of automatic assumptions that are incorrect and unfair that I don't deserve. So I get it both ways, and I think that's kind of what it's about. I don't know what is it? What's a good way for you to describe it? Because
Well,
you're right. I mean, it is an important point, and somehow the way we're talking about it isn't working for folks.
Here's what I would say is, like you, I have lived and traveled around the world, and maybe other than being in Tokyo or Beijing, I'm rarely the only white person in the room. But I have been in numerous scenarios, whether it be a social club, a religious institution, or a business event, where I've seen 300 white people and a person of color.
Yeah.
Or
a single.
or 150 men and one or two women. And I have often thought, what would it be like to be a person of color and consistently find myself as the one or two only people in an audience of one or two or three or 500 people of a different race?
Yeah.
We all have some bias within us. We all have some prejudice within us. And we all have some racial, bias in us. And so I've really thought, I believe that being a white American gives you a head start.
Yeah.
And I have read and researched enough and have enough friends of color to be very comfortable with that concept. That doesn't mean I should be ashamed of who I am. That doesn't mean I shouldn't have and haven't earned my success. But I'm much more empathetic and understanding of, I have never been in a room where I was the only person of that profile, unless I was on stage as the author. And so I'm just a little more mindful of recognizing, because I got a head start because of my race, I believe that, does not mean I am any less. It doesn't mean I shouldn't be entitled to all that I want to work to achieve, nor should I be embarrassed or pull back. I'm just a little more mindful of what it would be like not to be me.
Yeah, I think that is a great way to put it. I also think we need to talk, and I probably didn't even talk enough about this in Radical Respect. We need to talk a little bit about the way our economy is working right now, because there's a whole bunch of folks who are just underpaid right now, and dramatically underpaid. And I think part of what we need to respect is people, but we also need to do a better job respecting all different kinds of work that all different kinds of people do. I was just talking, I had this conversation on Guy Kawasaki's podcast, and he talked about an incident that he talks about in his book, Remarkable, where he was in front of his yard in San Francisco, kind of a Tony neighborhood, and he was trimming his hedges. Yeah. And a white woman came up to him and said, "Do you do lawns too?" Trying to hire him. And then we had this interesting conversation about I also love to work in my yard. And what happens to me as a white woman when I'm out pulling the weeds along the street. And very often people will stop and they'll say, they'll make a joke. They'll say, "Oh, did you get a new job?" As though somehow that work is beneath me, as though that work doesn't have dignity with it. And I think that part of what and that is that's caste system kind of stuff, and I think we really need to learn how to respect all different kinds of work and all the people who do the work.
Big fan of Guy Kawasaki. And I remember that story. He's coming on in a few weeks. Okay, let's get into Radical Respect. I think what you've written here is a gift on how to be a better human. And how to apply that in the workplace. So let's put behind the DE&I thing that is, alive in some places and dead in others and debate. But you've just written a book about how to be a better human in 2024 and beyond, and how to get stuff done. Your book is organized into two parts. Part one is everyone has a role to play. And part two of the book is manage power so power doesn't manage you. Your second chapter is titled How Leaders Can Demonstrate Institutional Courage.
Yes.
Riff on that.
So it is so tempting. I'm sure everybody listening can think probably in the last day of a time when you were in a meeting and somebody said or did something that kind of was awful. It left you gobsmacked. but everybody just ignored what happened. And so why do we do that? And what can leaders do to make sure that they are creating an environment? I mean, it can't be the leader every single time who intervenes, because a lot of this stuff that happens, they won't be in the room for. But what can leaders do to prevent bias, prejudice, and bullying from disrupting their teams, from creating the kind of disrespect on their team that's going to make it hard for their team to collaborate well and to achieve its goals? And so I think the first thing that is useful for leaders to do is to learn to break these things apart. Very often when we're faced with bias, prejudice, and bullying, we kind of conflate them as though they're one thing. And then the problem seems like this impossible, monolithic problem that we'll never solve. And we say, like, it's just human nature and there's nothing we can do about it. But if we break a complicated problem down into its component parts, then we can solve the problem. And so let's break apart bias, prejudice, and bullying, because they're not all the same thing. They're three very different things. Bias I define as sort of not meaning it. It's unconscious. Whereas prejudice is meaning it. It's very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And bullying, there's no belief, conscious or unconscious, going on. It's just being mean. And so what can leaders do about these things? In the case of bias, I recommend that they teach their teams to disrupt bias in the moment. Bias is kind of a pattern, and we as human beings are pattern makers. And the only way to change the pattern, a bad one, is to acknowledge that it's a bad one so that we can do better. Whereas with prejudice, you as a leader are kind of responsible for defining there's a boundary between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on the rest of the team. And so how do you define, it's easy to say that, really hard to know where that boundary is. So you've got to create a space for conversation, for open conversation, so that you can have a shared understanding on your team of where that boundary is. And then when it comes to bullying, it's really important that leaders create consequences for bullying, because if they don't, behavior that is tolerated will be repeated. So leaders need to create conversational consequences. They need to shut it down in the moment. They also need to create compensation consequences. You don't want to give good ratings and big bonuses to people on your team who bully others. And yet that happens all the time. So you want to be very conscious of how you are giving ratings, how you're giving bonuses. Atlassian had a no brilliant jerks rule. And if someone was bullied their colleagues and they couldn't get a good rating, no matter how good their results were. Same thing I saw, at least when I was at Apple, the performance management system worked that way. Whereas if it was found that you bullied your colleagues, you were going to get a bad rating no matter how good your results. And then the third thing you want to do is create sort of career consequences. The last thing you as a leader want to do is promote people on your team who bully others. I think too often we think that bullying is like a leadership attribute, and it is not a leadership attribute. It is a disqualifier for being a leader. So you don't want to promote. There comes a moment on too many teams' histories where the jerks begin to win. And that's the moment where the culture begins to lose. So whatever you do, don't promote people who bully others. You want to give them feedback, and hopefully they'll knock it off. They'll stop behaving that way. But if they don't, then you have to fire them. And this is very hard, because very often that person maybe thinks they can get away with bullying because they play a particular role on the team. And if you fire that person, it'll leave a hole. But better to have a hole than an a-hole. That's my word of wisdom on
that. This book is a great leadership book. It's not really a human resource book. It's a book for people like me and others that really need to kind of understand, so where did it all shake out? From COVID, from virtual work, from Me Too, and from Black Lives, and from DEI, and how as a leader now to be aware of when are you accidentally, or do you have some unconscious bias? We all have biases. I think it's healthy to talk about them, acknowledge them, and How do you have some prejudices that may be ingrained in you that you need to be a transformative figure and acknowledge it and then do better the more you know? And then, of course, there is bullying.
Yeah.
As I hear you, I can talk about times when I've been a bully. I thought it
Me
was the
too.
right thing to move the business forward, right? To create
Yeah.
the EBITDA. And I justified it as, well, but we're saving your job. And I look
Yeah.
back now and I'm horrified at some of the legal and ethical, but quite frankly, not acceptable things I might have done that I justified for other greater noble things. And so your book has been a great gift to me. I encourage every person who is leading others to buy Radical Respect and just find yourself in it. And for that matter, if you're working for a leader who may be a good person but is a bad leader, I really believe most people are good people. They're just
Yes.
untrained leaders. Because you write a lot about how to respond to bullying, how to deal on the receiving end of someone diminishing you. Is there anything you'd like to share before we talk about when and how and if ever to drop the F-bomb, my favorite chapter? Is there anything is there any insight you might give to someone who maybe is an individual contributor? They're not a
Yeah.
formal or a person of positional power, on how to set some boundaries and speak up for themselves if they find them that they're being on the receiving end of some of the more negative behaviors you talk about in the book.
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes I made for a lot of my career was I just pretended. It's kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I pretended stuff was not happening to me that was in fact happening. And there's a place and time for that. You want to choose your battles. But if you default to silence every single time, then over time you lose your sense of agency. And that's not good. So if this stuff is happening to you, I recommend sort of doing a quick return on investment of speaking up. There are risks of speaking up, but there's also a risk of remaining silent. And make sure that you're making, if you choose silence, that's fine, but make sure you're making a conscious choice. Now, if you decide you want to speak up, or if you're an individual contributor and you're an upstander, you don't want to be a silent bystander, but you notice something happening and you want to be a good upstander. One of the things that I find really helpful is to think about whether you're going to use an I statement, an it statement, or a you statement. So if you think it's bias, and you don't have to be sure what's going on, but if you think it's bias, try an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. One of my favorite stories of this comes from a colleague of mine who had started a company, and she went into a meeting with two men. She sat down in the center of the table because she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal, and then her two colleagues sat to her side. And when the first person came in, he sat across from the guy to her left, the next person sat across from the guy to his left, and then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving her dangling alone by herself in the center of the table. She started speaking, and when the other side had questions, they directed them at her two colleagues who were men. And it happened once, it happened twice, and finally one of her colleagues stood up and he said, "I think we ought to switch seats." That was an I statement, and that was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. Because once he did that, the other side realized what they were doing and they knocked it off. And he did that for three important reasons. He did it because he cared about her. There's always kind of an emotional aspect to this, and he didn't like seeing her get interrupted. He also did it because he just wanted to win the deal, and he knew that if the other side wasn't going to listen to her, they wouldn't win the deal. And the third reason he did it is because there's kind of an efficiency gain if you're the upstander. It was going to be easier for them to hear it from him than to hear it from her. So that's just an example of how you can use an I statement. I think we should switch seats. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. An I statement kind of holds up a mirror to the other folks in the room and lets them know what they're doing wrong. And usually, because they don't mean it, when they become aware of what they're doing, they stop. They change their behavior. Now, if it's prejudice, an I statement is not going to work because the other person's going to grin in the mirror. They're going to like what they see. So if it's prejudice, you need an it statement. An it statement, as I said, kind of helps show the other person where the boundary is between their freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on you. And an it statement can appeal to the law, It can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to sort of common sense. So, for example, I'd just come back from maternity leave, and I was chit-chatting with a guy before a meeting, and he said to me, well, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children. And this was like a gut punch, I just have come back from maternity leave. But I didn't really think he meant that the way it sounded, and so I tried to make a joke of it. I tried an I statement. And I said, oh, I decided to show up at work today because I wanted to neglect my children. And I was expecting him to kind of laugh and we would move on. He would acknowledge. But no, that's not what happened. I learned it was prejudice. He doubled down. He's like, oh no, Kim, this is no laughing matter. You really shouldn't be working. And so now I realize I need an it statement. So I said to him, it is an HR violation for you to tell me I'm neglecting my children by showing up at work today. And that had the desired impact. He backed way off. And then I used kind of common sense. I said, look, I'm not going to make a big deal of this with HR, but I think that we can agree that it is my decision, together with my partner, how we raise our children, just as it is your decision, together with your wife, how you raise your children. And at that point, we could kind of agree to disagree and move on and keep working together. But he didn't feel like he had to tell me how to live my life. So that's an it statement. Now, if it's bullying, I think you want a you statement. If an I statement kind of brings a person closer, then a you statement pushes them away. And I learned this from my daughter when she was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied on the playground. And I said to her, I was sort of recommending, she say, I feel sad. Tell this kid, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? I thought, oh my gosh, that's a really good point. And so we realized a you statement would be better. You can't talk to me like that. Or maybe a you question, what's going on for you here? Or even just a you non sequitur, where'd you get that shirt? The idea of the you statement is that you're now not accepting what the other person is dishing out at you. You are in an active stance. You're not submitting to them. You're in an active stance and asking them to answer your questions. So those are some thoughts. I, it, you. If it's bias, start with the word I and see what comes out of your mouth next. If it's prejudice, start with the word it and see what comes out of your mouth next. And if it's bullying, start with the word you and see what comes out of your mouth next.
Kim, speak to the concept of reinforcing what you call is a culture of consent. I'd like for people to kind of think about what their role is in that.
Yeah, so a culture of consent just means that if someone doesn't want to be touched in any way, maybe it's just a handshake, and maybe someone has decided after COVID they're never shaking another hand again. So don't shake their hand. If someone doesn't want to be touched, don't touch them. And if you don't know whether or not someone wants to be touched, don't touch. It's really not that complicated. And yet we get it wrong all the time. And so, if you're not sure if someone wants a hug, ask them, is it okay? Are you okay with hugs, or would you rather elbow bump? If you're not sure if someone wants a handshake. In fact, there was one time in my career where I stuck my hand out to shake it. It was very clear to me that the person whose hand I was offering to shake didn't want to shake my hand. But this was before COVID, and so I sort of had no idea why. And so I pulled it back and I said, I'm fine not shaking hands. If you'd rather, I'm happy to wave. And he looked enormously relieved, and he told me that he had, in his religion, he wasn't allowed to touch a woman who was not his wife in any way, shape, or form. And this caused a lot of trouble for him in corporate America, because that is not the assumption. So I think just learning how to be aware of what someone else wants and doesn't want in the way of physical touch. It is incumbent upon you as the initiator of the touch to know if the person wants to be touched in that way, whatever it is.
Well, speaking of which, I also think it's incumbent upon all of us, regardless of our role, to be aware of sort of what is the social landscape in the
Yes.
workplace, because there are different cultures and different organizations, and also society is shifting. I'd love it if you might coach me for just a moment.
Okay.
I am a 55-year-old white, straight, married husband, parent of 3 young boys. I was raised in
Okay.
the 70s in an upper middle class Caucasian family, college educated, my entire career in corporate America. I lean a little bit to the right of center, and I have a lot of friends from a lot of different walks of life.
Yeah. Perfect.
And I was raised as a Southern gentleman with years of cotillion to say yes, ma'am,
Yeah.
and no, ma'am, and thank you, and no, thank you, and sir, and ma'am. And I will now be in the Nordstrom Cafe with my 3 young boys who are being raised in a somewhat conservative family, but they attend a fairly liberal private school where
Yes.
gender diversity and gender fluidity isn't
Yes.
just a reality, it's almost kind of an obsession. I mean, my boys spend a lot of time trying to follow the bouncing ball and are called to the principal's office because they got the gender wrong because the person changed their gender last week. My point
Right.
is, it is hard to keep
Right.
up. And so we'll
Yes.
go to the Nordstrom rack, and there is a woman there that is transgender, and her name is, it doesn't matter what her name is, but she has a female name tag, and she hasn't fully transitioned. My point is, I will frequently say when this person, will call her Mary, it's her chosen name, not her birth name. And we're very respectful, and this waiter likes me, and I like her. And I will sometimes at the end find myself accidentally saying, thank you, man, or hey, man, have a good weekend. And this person is
Yeah.
clearly transgender. And my boys are like horrified. And I apologized once to this person. This person has waited on us on numerous occasions.
Yeah.
And I find myself these, what were social norms, right, of referring to people by their gender, they come out, and my boys just think I'm a cretin, right? A troglodyte when it comes to everything in life. Do you have any advice on what used to be respect and good manners is now in many cases offensive to people? How do you calibrate? I don't know your age, but like me, you were probably inculcated in decades. You talk a certain way.
57.
Yes.
Grew up in the South.
There you go. I'm
You know
56
what?
next month. Give me some advice to the millions of people who are like me that we want to be respectful. We also don't want to research every morning for half an hour. What's the new trend for the day, and how do I make sure that I am? You know, you get the point there. What's the center line of just good judgment?
Yeah. You know, I think it comes back to respect. Like, you like this waiter, and when people are transitioning, you have to transition with them. And that means you're going to get it wrong sometimes. And I think the key thing when you get it wrong, when you get someone's gender wrong, is to, first of all, extend a little bit of grace to yourself. And then you can sort of acknowledge, I got that wrong. And you can make amends by getting it right. Or what, it depends on what the thing is. And then you can apologize, and then you can try to change. But I think it all starts, I think we're so harshly judgmental right now of ourselves and others. And I think if we can just extend ourselves a little bit of grace, and then it'll become much easier to extend grace to others. I think that's the most important thing. And also, I think it's important to remember, like, what's okay for one person, and we already know this. This is like not a new thing I'm talking about. But what's okay for one person is not okay for someone else. So, for example, I really don't like it when people call me girl. Like, I'm not 57. My husband had his 57th birthday. I'm still 56 for a couple of months. But I am not a child. And so if you call me girl, it jars. It's like fingers on a chalkboard. But other people don't mind that. So I'm not going to say there's a rule you have to call women women. I'm just going to say, when you're talking to me, please don't refer to me as a girl, refer to me as a woman. And I think remembering that sometimes people want rules that will work for everyone, and there is no such rule. And this is not new. This has always been true. In Radical Candor, I talk about a story where I was in a meeting, and there's a guy on my team who I like and respect. We've been friends for ages. We had worked together for ages, and we had a really good relationship. And he kept confusing something, and he got it wrong once. I corrected him. He got it wrong again. I corrected it, and it was about the difference between Slovakia and Slovenia. We were localizing something, so it didn't have anything to do with something that might have more emotional impact. And he got it wrong a third time, and I was like, it's Slovakia, not Slovenia, dumbass. And that was fine in the context of our relationship because he knew I respected him, and he thought it was funny, and I knew he would think it was funny, and he knew I knew, we had that relationship. But I realized that the other people in the room were sort of horrified by the way I had treated him. And so I had still, even though it was fine that I called him that and talked to him that way, it wasn't fine with the others in the room. And I could tell from their faces that they were sort of horrified. And so I took the extra beat to say, look, Jared knows I respect him. He knows how brilliant I think he is. It's okay that I called him that in the context of our relationship, but I want to reassure the rest of you that I'm not going to talk to you that way if it's not okay with you. And that's respect. That's what we're talking about here.
Great story. What I have learned is I need to be more deliberate with my language because I'm so deeply inculcated in saying, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And occasionally this waiter, she has come to our table and said, hey, would you like some more iced tea? And I might say, no, thank you, sir. And it's just because this person presents himself as a female, but it's not fully transitioned in any way.
Well, and you knew them before, so.
Well, I actually didn't. I didn't.
Okay.
But they've kind of, you get the point. It's kind of complicated.
Yes.
And this person is listening. I just want her to know that I respect your decisions in life. They aren't my decisions on how I'm raising my boys, but I am raising my boys to be respectful of everyone and their choices, and we're trying to do better. And I think if this waiter were here, I think she would say, Scott, you're one of the nicest customers I have. And if your biggest infraction is once in a case, I hope that's the case. Okay, most importantly, tell us the story of when we can and cannot use the F-bomb.
One of my favorite stories from Radical Respect was I was at business school, and we were reading Charles Murray, and there was something that he had written that was basically like, young men are essentially barbarians for whom marriage and children, taking responsible for a woman and the children, is an essential civilizing force. And for me, I just couldn't believe I was being assigned to read this at business school. Although you and I, it sounds like, Scott, had very similar upbringings. Yes. I'm maybe left of center. And so I was mad. And I was in a study group, and I read this out loud, and I said, F that noise. I assume we're not allowed to drop an F-bomb on your podcast, but correct me if I'm wrong. And the next day in class, and at business school, your grade is mostly class participation. So it's really important that you talk. But I sort of felt like I was so angry about what I had read that I felt almost like I couldn't talk about it without dropping an F-bomb. And this was like, bias on top of prejudice, because the guys in the class dropped F-bombs with some frequency, but I was raised in the South I was raised as a girl in the South, and now I was a woman, and I didn't feel like I could drop an F-bomb. And so I was silent, and this guy who had been in my study group was an excellent upstander, and he kept trying to catch my eye. And finally, he raised his hand and he says, Kim has something to say. And I just said it. I just said, F that noise. I read the paragraph, and the professor thought it was funny, and you know what? It turned out it was okay. It was okay in that context that I do that. So I think good communication, as you know, gets measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. Yeah. I think this comes from you all, not from me. And so it's really important to know how that's going to land for another person. So it's not essential for me to, I do kind of tend to, in the normal course of events, swear like a sailor. But I don't want to do that if it's going to make it harder for other people to understand what I'm trying to say. So it's the same thing as getting someone who's transitioning, getting their gender right. You know, it's about communicating in a way that shows respect to the other person.
I think that's it. It doesn't matter whether you agree with it or not, whether it's something that is dear to you or don't care. It's about communicating in a way that is respectful to the other person. That may require you
Yes.
to separate your philosophy or your emotions or your religiosity or your
Habits of speech.
or
you
your
know?
habits of speech. That's exactly right. And so for me, what I am taking away from radical respect is just being a little more thoughtful and deliberate and careful, and being aware of my sort of ingrained responses, ingrained habits. If you have not yet read Radical Candor, what the heck, man? Get on the bandwagon. If you loved Radical Candor, I'm just telling you, you're gonna love Radical Respect, How to Work Together Better, from Kim Scott, author of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling book, Radical Candor. Kim, tell me, other than launching this book into the stratosphere and maintaining all of the interest in both Radical Candor and Radical Respect, what's on the horizon for you next?
You know, I'm writing a utopian novel. One of the things that I find, I have kids who are 15, and I find that my kids are very pessimistic about the future, and a lot of their friends are pessimistic about the future. And when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, I was very optimistic about the future, and I think that optimism was useful. I think it's really important. One of the people who worked for me had been a fighter pilot, and he talked about positive target identification. And he said, if you're flying a plane through the mountains, you don't want to get too fixated on the mountain that you're afraid of crashing into. You want to find the gap through the hills and focus there. And so I'm trying to imagine a world that is fair and reasonable, and where all these problems that seem so intractable, where we've sorted out climate change. And, even in the best of circumstances, it's not all sweetness and light. You know, people, it's hard to live your life. It's hard to raise kids. It's hard to be married, but it doesn't have to be as hard as it feels like things are right now.
Well, if Beyonce can crush country, Kim Scott can crush a utopian novel. Kim Scott, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate having you back on the podcast. Best of success with Radical Respect. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.